Thanks to everyone that's tuned into this Zoom. And if you guys are watching this afterwards on YouTube, hello to you guys too. We're incredibly excited to be welcoming you to what's going to be the first of our monthly webinar series, Economics Out of Equilibrium. And the purpose of this series is to kind of bring together academics and professionals from a wide range of perspectives and disciplines to kind of give their perspective on different topical issues in economics. The format of today's session is going to be some opening remarks by each of the speakers, Matthew, Jyoti, and hopefully Matt, if he joins us in a bit. And then we're going to move on to more of a Q&A discussion format, all to do with how governments can best tackle unemployment. So before we go into things, I'll just introduce speakers. So we've got Matthew Lawrence from Commonwealth and Jyoti Ghosh, who is now retired from Jawaharlal University after 30 years teaching there and is now at UMass Amherst. It's amazing to have these guys here with us today. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Matthew.
Great, thank you very much, and hello everyone joining us online. I'm Matthew Lawrence. I'm the founder and director of Commonwealth, which is a UK-based think tank looking at ownership models and institutions for systemic change in our economic and environmental worlds. I mean, it's a sort of great series to be kicking off with. I think, it's fairly clear, but it's worth restating to begin with just quite how much of an extraordinary shock to our sort of economic, political, and ecological systems COVID-19 is. I think by now it's clear, deeper and more systemic than the sort of financial crisis, for example. And this is not just a sort of profound shock to demand, but it also strikes at some of those sort of constitutive institutions at the heart of capitalism and indeed of all forms of economic organization, labor, work, our relationship with the natural world. And so this is a profound sort of economic moment and crisis and traumatic moment, but also sort of potential chance to rethink, to reimagine a better world to emerge out of that. I want to touch on sort of 5 areas, sort of UK specific, but I think hopefully with wider sort of parallels, and it's sort of timely given the Chancellor's announcements earlier this afternoon in terms of economic policy in relation to work, employment, and the crisis. I want to touch on 5 things. So 1, the importance of triage and timing. 2, the role of public investment in securing a sort of better future and sort of green recovery. 3, briefly touch on this argument about affordability, which I think in some ways is the easiest to deal with. 4, a stress on the quality, not just the quantity of work, and how we can design sort of fulfilling, rewarding, enriching work. And 5, the role of ownership and inequality, and how we are seeing this concentration of power under COVID, but what are the alternative strategies to sort of design and build out a much more equitable and democratic economic system, not just in the UK, but globally. So I think, first of all, in terms of that triage point, I think what we've seen in the UK and what we've seen very sort of directly today is the Chancellor recognise that he had designed a set of policies in terms of sort of stabilising employment during the crisis that were not actually aligned, no longer aligned with the depth and nature of the virus. So, much of the sort of job support schemes that people have been talking about have been designed with the idea that we were sort of moving out of the worst of the virus. Yet it's very clear we're now sort of doubling down to sort of second stage of an expansion of infection rates, and we're nowhere near out of the woods. And so I think the first part in sort of thinking about sort of work and employment, I think many of the moves today are welcome. But I think it's that focus on making sure that if what we're caring about is employment, what we're caring about is household income, individual income, we need to not be guided by sort of abstract timings, but actually link up sort of the public health emergency with the economic health of our economy, and sort of make sure they go in tandem in terms of job support sort of initiatives match the cycle of the virus. The second thing is, I think, much of what's announced today is very much triage. It's about sort of protecting employment, but it's not going to be enough. There will still be many job losses in the months, potentially sort of years ahead, as we sort of live with the consequences of the virus. And so I think there's this extraordinary role for public investment to secure the recovery going forwards, to both sort of create some new work, but also to sort of restructure the economy, to create an economy that's centered on care, centered on sort of sustainability, centered on justice. And I think we can sort of see some of sort of the potential here. So some work by IPPR, a UK-based think tank, suggests there's roughly sort of a £30 billion annually investment gap just to reach the government's own sort of 2050 net zero target. And I'd argue that targets too late in many ways. But even to reach that, which if we can sort of scale up investment around 30 billion mark, that would be creating around 1.5 million jobs over the next 5 to 10 years. And in some ways, given the scale of the crisis, we need to bring that forwards. And because the private sector is not really going to be sort of injecting that demand, because private households are not going to be injecting that demand, and because unlike, for example, in 2008, 2009, when sort of China was the great motor of the global economy, it's quite different to today. You know, there's not really sort of the same demand from China as then. You know, it's not like the sort of global economy can pull the UK out of a sort of, you know, the lack of demand. So there's a huge role for public investment, public spending, whether that's in social care, healthcare, whether that's about sort of greening our transport system, it's about improving the energy efficiency of our homes. There's a whole range of areas and sectors of the economy in which public investment is vital if we're going to create the good jobs we need going forwards. That then brings to the obvious sort of question, which I think in some ways, as mentioned, is the easiest to deal with at this point, unless you really have ideological blinkers on, which is, well, can we afford it? And I think, you know, the obvious answer is it's absolutely necessary, and what's necessary we can afford. And so in terms of, you know, the ballooning public debt, etc., which is framed as a barrier, I think what's very clear is the UK can afford to borrow to invest. It can do that because interest rates are extraordinarily low. Indeed, you know, there's talk now of negative interest rates, of these extraordinary moments in monetary policy. And it's so low, in fact, that even with the doubling of the UK's debt from pre-crisis, the Treasury would still be paying less to service this debt than in any other time in the 20th century. So it's more than affordable. In fact, it's absolutely vital we borrow to invest. And combined with that, you know, with coordination between fiscal policy, so the Treasury, and monetary policy, the Bank of England, by coordinating in terms of, you know, who buys bonds, coordinating on the issuance of government bonds, it's more than possible to keep that debt profile, sort of the cost of debt over time, sustainable. So it's vital that we borrow to invest, and critically, is absolutely affordable within the context of the crisis. But if we've got that sort of investment surge, you know, at a time when it's right, you know, when we're sort of emerging out of sort of, you know, tier 2, tier 3, emerging to a sort of better economic scenario, it's not just about the quantity of jobs, but the quality of work. Because I think what we've seen now for many years is sort of under-regulated labour market with deep power imbalances in our economy. The quality of work for too many people is insecure, it's unrewarded, it lacks dignity, it lacks sort of esteem, the autonomy that everyone deserves. And that's about the deep institutional design of our economy. It's about corporate governance. How do we design and allocate voice and power within the company? It's about industrial relations. How do our labour laws give power to workers collectively, but also individual rights as workers and just as citizens, or indeed not as citizens, just as people resident in this country? How do we design our welfare system so that people have power and income to live well, to live securely, to live autonomously outside the labour market? So there's been some interesting upsurge in this idea of a minimum income guarantee by places like IPPR, like the New Economics Foundation. And I think that's fundamental to designing good work, because, you know, we need to rebalance power in all its dimensions. So I think thinking about those deep institutional aspects of our economy, of governance, of industrial relations, of our welfare state, these are fundamental to how we improve the quality of work going forward, so that people have dignity and autonomy, both collectively and individually. And then I think sort of a fifth element, which is a sort of you know, a major focus of Commonwealth, is this question of ownership and overlapping that of control. So I think one of the things we're seeing quite strikingly is a concentration of ownership in the economy. So distressed assets are being sort of hoovered up by private equity. They're being hoovered up by sort of, you know, sort of more concentrated, powerful forms of capital. We're seeing obviously huge and acute economic distress amongst a great range of sort of SMEs, of smaller sort of companies, of, you know, sort of the high street. And this is going to sort of, the risk here is, of course, that we emerge into a new economic landscape in which power is even more concentrated, in which sort of vast asset manager companies like BlackRock control even more shares of public companies, in which private equity, which already has a huge stake in, for example, something like adult social care, has got even more of a claim on the economy, even more of an extractive, financialized claim on the economy, and that less and less people have a stake and a say in their place of work, in their community, in their sort of, you know, in their neighborhoods. So we think of strategies in and around, you know, the pluralization of ownership models, the sort of scaling up of new institutions that give people genuinely a stake in the say, in where they work, whether that's through deliberate efforts to sort of disperse capital through, sort of whether it's employee share schemes, employee-owned companies, cooperatives. There's a whole range of mechanisms that can be done there, through to things like the sort of extension of community wealth building as a strategy, a deliberate sort of effort to think more strategically about procurement, about local spending, about local labour market design, about how pluralistic or concentrated local economies are, and what the type of policies we can design to influence that. And I think related to that, which is obviously one of the themes of this, is this question of working time. Can local economies, but indeed national policymakers, use this crisis to think about the balance of work, not just sort of number of hours, but sort of a better balance between life and work? And I think sort of a community welcoming strategy can help address that. So I think just to sort of recap, I think there's this overarching theme, but I do think this is a moment, a profound economic shock, deeper and more systemic in many ways than 2008, 2009. And I think that there will be no post-COVID in the sense of discrete ending of the crisis. We will simply be sort of moving into a world which inevitably is tied into the consequences of COVID. But within that, I think there's this question of the design and implementation of economic triage, the vital importance of public investment, affordable public investment to shape the recovery, and the role of institutional design, whether that's corporate governance, whether that's industrial relations, whether that's policies like community wealth building, to make sure that as we emerge, when we emerge, it's not just the quantity, but the quality of work, that we can build a better economy at the back of it.
Thanks so much for that, Matthew. And I'd also like to welcome Matt from the Adam Smith Institute. Just had some issues joining Zoom, but it's all resolved now. And yeah, I guess I'll hand over to Matt straight away, if that's okay, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Apologies for being late onto the call. I thought it was very interesting, Matthew, for what you were saying, sort of long-term structural issues that exist within the economy, corporate governance structures, people's sense of worth at work. But I think realistically, what a lot of people are worried about right now is, do they have money on the table? Can they feed and clothe their kids? Can they make sure the mortgage is paid? Is their business going to survive? And I think we should describe the crisis as being sort of twofold. There's the immediate upfront risk involved in the pandemic, and like we can see this as a discrete event, or we can look at the sort of like how the economy has to be restructured at the end of it. I think like actually one of the most interesting features of this pandemic has been the way in which basically left and right converged onto a series of interventions in the economy to ensure that what was seen as effectively as a natural disaster was treated non-discriminatorily, large amounts of cash intervention, and that we saw, monetary support for businesses, monetary support for individuals, and basically as much money as you could physically throw at the problem, whether you're in the rich world or the poor. Less so as it goes on. And in fact, more and more, we're seeing a divergence in the way in which different countries are treating this crisis, and like how long they can afford to as well. Of course, slightly richer countries are able to borrow on their credit lines at lower rates for longer periods of time, thanks to longer build-ups of people's belief in their ability to repay. Now, post-crisis, I think, like, again, it's effectively a gamble on whether, like Matthew, you think this is a crisis that never really ends, or if you are more like the sort of super forecasters who are looking at the vaccine and saying, look, this is a crisis which does have effectively a fixed end date, where the disease does go away, where we're able to get back into normal life, and we're able to do all the things that we said that we enjoyed previously, and then it'll allow some level of adjustment to new habits, new desires, and so on. And if you believe in that second one, that actually it is a discrete event, and that there will be new businesses, new opportunities, and people need to adapt post-event, there's a very different policy prescription than if you think this is the new normal, and that we all need to change and adapt now. And in fact, like, this is a bit of a debate that's happening on the right in the Western world, at least. There's a bunch of people who think that this is it, this is the new normal, so you need to restart what Hayek and Friedman and so on used to describe as sort of creative destruction, that we need to make sure that we reallocate the resources, or that individuals reallocate resources based on the new normal. And people like me who sit there and say, no, the vaccine is likely to arrive. There are 200 or so currently in production or in trial phases. The most advanced ones are in phase 3 trials. It's one of the most impressive innovations in mankind's history. And the likelihood is by the end of next year, at least I believe, that we'll see a rollout to a point where it's at least we're moving back to more normality. And therefore you can start to remove some of those supports, because after a natural disaster, you are poorer. And you do need to have the efficient allocation of resources even more. In fact, when you're rich, you can waste money. When you're poor, you can't afford to waste money as much. Now, I sort of struggle with the idea that we need to have grand plans of discussing how companies should and shouldn't organize, or that they should and shouldn't work with their workers, or all their family structures or whatever. I think that kind of is exactly what the market system is there to do, to allow companies to experiment and play with different forms of structure internally, but also with who they're actually trying to get custom from, and then leave it to customers to decide. Now, as I do realize and I appreciate that even every different market has different institutional backgrounds, issues, protections, and so on, that mean that not every market is as competitive as it could be or should be. But the freer the market, typically, the freer the allocation of resources that allow you to more accurately meet the real level of demand and supply in the economy for any given good or service. Now, we are going to see an economic crisis that follows this, because I know, in fact, we risk one from non-intervention at this stage. I was very worried when I was seeing moves earlier this week to have less loose monetary policy in the West. I was worried that Rishi Sunak, as the British Chancellor in the UK, wasn't going to provide large amounts of monetary support or financial support to companies where they had restricted revenue raising. Because the real risk that cascades from that is that you end up with, you're not able to pay your debts, you're not able to pay your employees. So you end up with mass firm failure, cascading credit risk, and then huge amounts of unemployment. And that's the kind of mass depression level situation that you get in the 1930s. We haven't seen quite that. And actually what we're seeing is there is an increased level of, so say QE, but there's also an increased level of financial support to companies that are in restricted areas. And so we won't see the same level. I think we'll see this, like what we saw in the first level of furlough and afterwards, where there are some jobs that have gone, there are some companies that have gone, but there are, like, fundamentally, those fundamentals of the economy are still there and still strong. Now, what do you end up with after that? Well, you might wish to have some reskilling programs, retraining programs, monetary pots available for people to be able to relocate. But you also want to make all those things that made the economy successful in the first place, you want to increase those. So we said in our report, Winning the Peace, that one of the things that sort of Germany did very well after World War II was to move the state out of the economy, out of restrictions, out of its guidances, whereas the United Kingdom did exactly the opposite, and tried to guide and plan the economy for the post-war period, and ended up as the sick man of Europe. And I think that we have to be very careful in the UK, at least, not to follow that same model after this pandemic. And we have to say that, look, the things that we need to remove the costs of or reduce the costs of, we need to make it cheaper to employ people. We need to make it cheaper for people to go and get education. We need to make it so, like, let's remove employers' national insurance or increase the threshold for those. We need to make it so that we can reduce corporation tax. We need to reduce or increase the annual investment allowances that allow companies to invest in machinery and also buildings, so that we can make sure that the right parts of the economy are doing the right thing. We should also be looking at making sure that land is efficiently used. So we should be moving to a land value tax rather than a business rate system. And that would allow us to at least ensure that, like, what we got a lot of benefit from the market economy is at least enhanced. And I know that Matthew may sit there and say, no, not the market economy. But if we're going to have one, at least making sure that it works, right? And so, like, let's remove some of those frictions. And I think I'll finish there. But because we can have a lot of discussion around things. But I think what we need to make sure is that we don't try and throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the end of this crisis, because I do think it has a discrete end, and I do think that we can probably bounce back better if we allow individuals to lead the recovery and not the state.
Thanks, Matt. And now I'll hand over to Jayati before we go into some of the questions that have been submitted. If you guys in the chat want to keep submitting questions, that'd be amazing.
Okay, hi. Well, thanks a lot, and good to be here with all of you. I think a lot of the points have already been made, but I'm really going to be a little more international about what's happening. And I think there are a couple of things that we have to bear in mind. It's first of all, that all this stuff about fiscal discipline and the need for governments to rein in their debt at all points and so on is essentially political. And that's very evident now. That when there was a huge crisis, suddenly the government said, oh yeah, sure, we can have 10% deficit, 15% deficit, 25% deficit in the immediate term. In the advanced economies, we have had fiscal responses ranging from 5% to 30% of GDP, which is unthinkable, which could not have been imagined even a year before. So developed countries, when they wanted it, they found the money. So all of that fiscal austerity stuff that we were fed all of this time, that it's expansionary, that you need to do it and so on, that's not just a myth. It has been exposed to be very, very deeply political and oriented towards the interests of finance. Developing countries, on the other hand, we haven't had this. Actually, developing countries have had a smaller fiscal response than they had after the global financial crisis. And that's alarming because this is much worse, as I think both Matthew and Matt have kind of suggested. We actually have a more severe crisis in terms of employment, and we have a much more moderate fiscal response. And too much of that fiscal response has gone into saving big companies who don't actually contribute much to employment. So in large parts of the developing world, not all, there are exceptions, but in most parts, we are getting fiscal responses that are actually not going to address employment or livelihood. So remember also the other thing about developing countries, 70% of the workers are informal. That is, they don't have proper contracts, there's complete freedom to hire or fire, they don't have legal or social protection of any kind. So it means that when you lose a job temporarily, there's no concept even of a furlough. You lose the job, you don't get a wage, you don't eat the next day. And we're talking about 70% of the workers in developing countries being informal. Governments not spending enough either in terms of employment intensive kinds of expenditure and investment, or the kind of social protection that you would need to make sure that people can keep going in this kind of crisis. And this is happening in the middle. And so Matt, I think, was talking about how we shouldn't sort of stop this when the crisis ends. Well, this is not even happening as the crisis goes on. So we are talking about a very, very odd kind of dislocation now between developed and developing countries. And it's something that is being pushed by the international community. It's not only the stupidity of developing country governments. I mean, it's true, some of them are being stupid also, right? And because they've absorbed that whole neoliberal paradigm for so long. But it's more than that. It is the real inability of developing countries to face the fact that you've got all these cross-border flows of finance that are threatening you the minute you say you're going to spend a bit more, or that you will have a slight increase in your public debt or whatever. You have the collapse in foreign exchange, which means many countries can't actually afford to even service their external debt, which has been piling up over the last few years already. And we have various global strategies of tax avoidance, multinationals and the rich, which are actively enabled by the rich countries. So it's not just, if you like, a global mindset, an ideological mindset of neoliberalism, which is affecting policy making in the South. It's also specific architecture that is preventing developing country governments from doing things. So what should we, if we're really trying to rethink how do we do post-pandemic public expenditure for employment generation? And let's be very clear, it can't be done without public expenditure. It's not going to happen. Without the public expenditure, especially in infrastructure, in amenities, in care economy, massive investment in the care economy, and in creative activities. Without that, you're not going to get the employment generation. So how do we do that? And I think it's important to remember that it's the advanced countries that are still setting the rules of the game. And so pressure has to come from within there as well. It can't just come from a bunch of people in the developing South jumping up and down. It has to actually come from within developed countries. What needs to be done? SDR allocation. The IMF can issue global liquidity and distribute it according to shares of equity in the IMF. It means developing countries will get less, but that's okay, because whatever they get is still a huge additional availability of foreign exchange, and it would make a huge difference to them. We need a major dealing with sovereign debt issues. And remember, 90% of sovereign debt and all the bonds issued in the developing world are issued in London and New York. So it's the legal rules in London and New York that are setting the terms and are creating these destructive tendencies whereby in Africa and large parts of Latin America, governments are spending more on debt servicing than they are on health at the moment. So we need a major strategy for dealing with sovereign debt. We need tax cooperation, specifically for unitary taxation of multinationals. So Apple, Google, Amazon cannot get away with doubling their profits and paying less taxes today than they paid before the pandemic. And that's very simple. The possibility is already there of a unitary system of taxation where every country says, I'm going to tax you on my share of your global profits, not on what you say was your profit in my country. And we need rules to generate global funds for certain kinds of public investment, because let's face it, this is just the starter. The pandemic is the starter. Climate change is already upon us. And that's going to be a much more fundamental and existential challenge. So I think we really have to think of the way the global system is preventing the kinds of investment we need for employment generation. And it's not enough to think in our own countries alone. We obviously have to do that, but we also have to think in a much more broad sense about changing that architecture. Thanks. I think you're muted. Huh?
Yeah, I'm muted. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much for that, Jyoti. That was incredibly insightful. So before we open up to the questions that have been submitted, I just wanted to give any of you guys the chance to respond to anything that one of the other panelists said. If you guys don't want to, then we can move straight into the questions.
I mean, sure, I used to be one of these people who used to insure sovereign debt in the city of London. So, and do political risk and look at like how country risk. And one of the reasons why you would assign a higher level of risk rating to certain countries rather than others, apart from, you know, long-term build-up of trust between, you know, constant paybacks and repayments at the levels at which people said they were going to pay and so on and so forth, was because like there isn't as much of an uncertainty about nationalization, expropriation, and the sort of free running of the market economy underneath. I think, Jyoti, when you were saying about, you know, we need to make sure that Apple and Google and so on, it's like, well, that's lovely, but they are providing a service and a good and like a level of profit that's coming from it. If you wish to stop their service, or if you would stop their activity in a market, then I can't trust the government to act in a fair and appropriate way. And if that's the mood music that's coming from a country, or a mood music that's coming from a region, then it does increase the cost and risk likelihood that I sit there and say, well, I'm not going to be able to lend, or I'm not going to be able to insure at the same level as if it wasn't. And then I know that causes a spiral effect of do I trust and do you trust, and therefore like who's willing to pay as much. And yes, that increases those interest rates. But I would say that that's the same risk that you have in the West as if you suddenly decide to have large-scale market interventions in normal times. I would say this is an extraordinary time, which is why interventions are reasonable and good. But if you start to have those huge deficits in normal times, or you start to have those expropriations or appropriations of property in normal times in the West as well, then the same thing would happen to our debt interests. And we would be paying more on international investment interests than we would be able to pay on our education or our rails. There's nothing special about the West in this regard. It's just the fact that we have had a free-flowing market economy for the past few hundred years that has allowed us to build up a sense of confidence and responsibility. It could very easily have gone completely the other way in December, before, like, if the UK economy had the UK had decided to elect the Jeremy Corbyn and that kind of government had been involved in trying to nationalise various parts of the industries rather than seeking to uphold the market economy, which is effectively what Sunak has done with the corporate welfare that has been pushed out during this pandemic.
Sure.
Can I respond? Or
Yeah.
do you want to? Yeah. Okay. Look, couple of things here. Tax is not expropriation. Okay. We are not saying shut down Google, Amazon, anything. What is being said? Tax multinationals at the same rate that you tax domestic companies. In other words, genuine level playing field. What's happening now? Amazon is effectively paying no tax in about 27 countries that it operates, and is paying 0.5% tax in some others, and in extreme cases, maybe 1% of its total profits as tax. Okay. How is it able to do that? Because of what is called base erosion and profit shifting. It's shifting all its profits into low tax jurisdictions under the guise of saying, well, all the intellectual property is created in Ireland, or all the real stuff is happening in Delaware or in some other country which has a low tax jurisdiction. That's what it's doing. And it's able to do that because it is a multinational. It has offices in many different countries. Domestic companies do not have that option. They pay the 20% or the 25% or whatever is the rate. What is being said here? Do not allow multinationals to pay a different rate, a lower rate. And that's not expropriation, Matt. That is simply saying that everybody is paying a tax, right? Unless you say all tax is expropriation, in which case I think we don't have a discussion at all. We're really saying that multinationals should not be able to abuse the loopholes in tax laws to enable them to avoid tax altogether. There are, of course, the extraordinary cases of, the double Dutch Irish sandwich and so on, where you can situate your company in Ireland and then do the double taxation treaty with Netherlands, take advantage of that to end up paying zero tax. I don't think that's good capitalism. I'm sorry, I really don't. And it's not presumably what you meant either. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, on debt. You're absolutely right that different countries face different degrees of because of their ratings. Of course, let's not kid ourselves that credit rating agencies have been very efficient and remarkably good. When you were talking about how the UK and the US have had these wonderful stable systems, I mean, really, which world have you been living in for the last decade? Not the one I've been in for sure, and I've been a lot in the developed world, I promise you. So let's not kid ourselves that these are very wonderful, secure, stable, well-informed financial systems. They're not. Quite honestly, they're very incompetent, inefficient, and in many ways they suck badly. Okay. However, what's the idea of having a higher interest rate or a spread of the interest rate in a developing country? It's that there's a greater risk attached to it. What is that risk? Of eventual default or non-payment, right? Not expropriation, we're talking about debt here. So it's an eventual default that you're factoring in when you charge a higher interest rate. Developing countries typically pay several percentage points more above LIBOR than developed countries, okay? The average developed advanced economy can get a very, very low interest rate for its debt. The average developing country will pay anything from 1% to 3 to 4 percentage points higher interest rate on that debt. Why is that? It's for the risk. What are the creditors saying? We will charge higher interest because we're taking on this risk, but when that risk fructifies, we will demand the full payment. So you are asking for a free ride, or the creditors are asking for a free ride, where they're saying, we're going to charge you a higher interest because we have to factor in the risk that you may not repay. But if there is any possibility of a debt reduction, of any kind of haircut, we will not allow it. We will insist on the full payment, having already charged you more interest for that risk. There's a problem there. That's not an efficient functioning market. I mean, any economics of information stuff should tell you that doesn't work, right? So don't see all of these as expropriation or, oh, it's the end of the world, socialism. No, this is just rational market functioning. If you want an efficient functioning capitalism, these are the minimum things you have to need. You're not getting an efficient functioning capitalism at the moment. Okay, let me stop here.
I guess I'll give you a very short opportunity to respond to that if you want to, Matt, and then we will move on to some of the questions that we've been receiving. And also, Matthew, if you want to jump in at any point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use a quick analogy. If just to go back to that, if you want to go back to the idea that that's not a functioning market, then in which case, like, mortgages aren't a functioning market because institutions are able to get low-level borrowing as
No, this is ridiculous.
aren't able to get.
Certain kinds of markets, or a mortgage market in itself is not. You have to take a specific mortgage market and say, is that functioning or not?
I mean,
don't say credit markets are not functioning. Don't be so general, for God's sake.
The idea that
don't be so general. No, please, don't be so general. Be exact.
You're being exceptionally generalist here.
No, I'm not. I'm being precise. I'm being very precise.
The idea that, like, you can
there is no such thing as a mortgage market
rather than institutions that have different credit ratings to the individuals, and individuals aren't able to get the same rates because they're not as.
We are talking about countries. You are not listening, Matt. We are talking about different countries getting different credit rates.
Yes,
not individuals.
Different levels of development.
Not individuals. We are talking about countries.
Yes, because they're at different levels of development and different levels of income potential and higher risk of default. The idea that the spread different is unjust in any way, shape, or form is not true. But
you haven't understood what I said. I said if you are charging a higher interest rate because you anticipate a default, in the eventuality of a default, you cannot demand full payment because you already factored in that risk in the higher interest rate. It's very different from saying you should not have different interest rates.
That is exactly
it's very different.
As any secured loan.
It's like an insurance company saying, I charged you a higher premium, but now when you die, I'm not going to pay you.
Well, that's why insurance.
Think of it.
That's why insurance companies have excesses. That's why mortgage companies say they can repossess the house. If it's a secured asset, then yes, that's exactly what they can do, and that's perfectly reasonable. Otherwise,
an insurance company, by the way, no, I'm sorry, a life insurance.
Yeah. I guess
pay a higher. Okay, we can go.
Yeah. Guys, I don't think we're getting anywhere really on this point.
Yeah. So
what I'll do is I'll move us along to the Q&A, and we can start with Matthew, and then we'll move on to Jayati and Matt after that. So Louise Koch asked, at the moment, what would you say the priority should be? Should it be to maintain jobs, or use the crisis as an opportunity to reshape work, especially in sectors which are perhaps not sustainable? And she gave some examples such as mining or automobile industries. So yeah, Matthew, what would you say in response to that?
Well, firstly, just, ashamed to sort of have to interrupt Jayati and Matt there, because that's probably more, the popcorn was probably like coming out across the Zoomosphere. And what I would have added to that is just that, Matt refers to sort of a free market, and I guess I'd characterize our economy much more as sort of rentierized market, in which sort of we don't really have sort of free flows of markets, but we have actually sort of concentrated ownership or power, which actually I think relates to some of Jayati's points. And there's a lot of rent seeking, and indeed, Matt mentioned sort of public ownership, and I think one of the cases you could make is that if you look at sort of margins for, let's say, the water sector, 35%, 40%, these infrastructure rentiers, often sort of skimming off the top of assets that were built through public investment. These aren't sort of really competitive, dynamic industry companies. They're sort of rentiers. And I think in some ways there might be a sort of symmetry, a sort of overarching symmetry between us in and around the agreement that we do want better functioning markets, but I think it's perhaps the difference is the extent to which we believe like markets are constituted by politics and therefore by power, and therefore how you enter into and how that market functions. So that's just one thought. On the specific question, I think Matt's point when he started about sort of people are worried about their mortgages, about putting food on the table, etc. I think that's absolutely right. So I do think this a focus right now as we sort of go into sort of a second wave, etc. is I think trying as far as possible to sort of retain that employment link, which I think the Chancellor has clearly backtracked and changed the design of the JSS today. So I think that is important, but I don't think it's necessarily an either or. And I do think we should be thinking about the long-term restructuring the economy towards sustainability, towards the government's own net zero target, although I'd argue at an accelerated rate. So I think we shouldn't sort of necessarily counterpose that, though I think sort of right now, a clear priority is not seeing a huge spike in unemployment. The other thing I'd sort of touch on briefly is, again, there's an interesting question about how far is this just a sort of temporary blip, and how far vaccine comes in March of next year and it's, everything's back to normal. Well, I think there's a question of like, well, actually was, the economy, whether it's the UK or the global economy, performing effectively when we've got, well, on the global level, huge amounts of informal unemployment and sort of global poverty. In the UK, we've got stagnant productivity. We could all list some of the problems. Of course, the UK economy has some real strengths, but overall, the balance sheet, it looks like we could really improve. So I think going back to normal, we shouldn't be satisfied with that on either wings of, I guess, British politics. But I think the wider point is that even if there is a vaccine next year, 2 years from that, there might well be more vaccines, because this is not sort of a natural disaster. It's actually emerged from, I guess, the sort of interconnection of globalized markets, commodity trade, sort of the encroachment of urbanization in China into sort of, there's a whole host of reasons why this is not just a sort of like an earthquake. There's actually there's a politics behind the emergence of pandemics. But I think the wider point, and actually touched on it, is the climate crisis. So I was sort of looking at something yesterday from the National Academy of Science in the US, in which their central projection is by 2070. So okay, there's a little while away, but by 2070, 3 billion people will be living in areas of the world in which they will be sort of experiencing on a regular basis temperatures that we only currently have in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So there's a fundamental set of disruptions coming down the track, and that's just one example. There's obviously many more. There's a fundamental set of really deep disruptions to how human societies are organized and how we can function, that the pandemic is kind of the canary down the coal mine. And so even if there is a vaccine, I do think there's the scale of disruption. We can add in AI and all the other things, although a bit of a sort of jobs are all going to be automated away skeptic. But you can add in a set of these massive disruptive trends. That means, okay, yes, there might be a vaccine at some point, but we are entering a period of real turbulence, and that's where I do think the role of the state in structuring investment in markets, sort of shaping, is vital. And that goes back to that question of, we need active labour market intervention to create the good jobs of the future, rather than just leaving it to a pure sort of free market.
Amazing, thanks for that. Matt, so going back to that question of kind of prioritizing keeping people in employment, or prioritizing like creative destruction and letting kind of new industries come forth, what would you say would be kind of your perspective?
I mean, right now, it's about ensuring as much of the underlying economy continues to exist as possible as we go through this period. So I would say prioritizing employment is the key. However, after that, there's a great sort of Friedman quote during a visit to China, and he's shown a big dam building project. And they say, why are they using shovels? And they said, oh, well, why aren't they using diggers? And they say, well, we created 10,000 jobs. And he's like, oh, it's not a dam building project, it's a job creation project. In which case, take away the shovels and give them spoons. Because it's not really about producing an output, it's about making sure that the people have got some jobs for some reason. But that's not actually helpful in the wider economy. It's not very helpful in terms of human progress. And I think that, and it very much reflects the kind of like state level economy at the time that China had, and very much does not have now. But in terms of what the global economy needs to go back to, and in fact, I would say I'm a bit of an AI skeptic as well, Matthew, when it comes to sort of like these jobs are all going to disappear. I think typically what happens, or at least what history has shown, is that as new technologies arrive and they make obsolete older technologies, people start to revalue what they're like what they really do value. And one of the things that's most interesting for me is that we've lost a lot of the sort of like personal care time, personal human-to-human interaction over the last 100 years, moved into offices and workplaces and so on. And I think one of the things that as we have an aging population, and also that we'll want to spend a bit more time with our kids, is that we'll start to value those careers where you're able to look after children, you're able to look after elderly parents, more so than we value people who input stuff into spreadsheets or who trawl through legal documents, which are heavily easily automatable. And so we'll just end up with, yes, okay, fine, these high-level, even white-collar careers have been automated, but actually we start to value sort of pastoral care things a lot more. And I don't think we should be scared of people revaluing things. I think that, prior to this pandemic, you might have said working from home was not very well valued by employers, that people, had a facile value for Netflix and Google and Amazon and whatever. But people do now value these things a lot more than they used to. I think actually as it ends and people are able to go and enjoy the restaurants and pubs and bars and stuff more, that you'll see that they suddenly value those a lot more than they value their Netflix subscription. So I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about sort of like, long run implications on this. But the whole point of the market economy is that it is designed not to flow based on what 3 or 4 people on a Zoom call think the economy should be, but based on the billions of interactions on a daily basis that many of us make. Now, they're flawed. Some of us have very short attention spans. Some of us are looking very much at the long picture. Some of us are worried about climate change on a global scale, and some of us are worried about the fact that the river's a bit brown. There's not very many fish in it anymore, and that needs to be fixed. Although there's too much dog poop on the park grass. Now, all of those are completely legitimate, and all of them are sort of environmental matters, and every single one of them should be treated with respect. No one should be sat there and saying that this is the only thing that you should be focusing on or whatever. And it's very difficult for me when we sit there and say that we need to focus on, we need to realign the economy to basically be only about one particular issue or only like sustainable in some respect. Because I think with these long sweeping marches, we end up immediately ignoring more pressing concerns that other people have and treating them without the level of respect that they deserve. But I think, and I don't think the market is perfect. And I do think it is flawed because I think humans are flawed, but I think it is less flawed than deciding things on other people's behalf.
Amazing, thank you. And Jayati, did you have anything to add on that question?
Hi, yeah, I'm just wondering whether I should look at all the questions and answer everything together because we don't seem to have that much time left. So, yes, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah. There you go. One other question that was submitted particularly to you was about steps that the Indian government can take in terms of reforms to bringing more women into the labour market, given the devastating impact of the pandemic, which has led to a huge loss of jobs for women in India. So is that something that you could respond to?
Sure, yes. Okay, so let me begin with just the broader question. The thing is that this pandemic is coming at a time when the global economy was already grappling with a whole bunch of other fairly major changes. There is the fourth industrial revolution, as it's been called, the fact that there are huge changes in automation and artificial intelligence and so on, which are changing the ways in which we do many things and which are definitely reducing employment in some sectors and potentially increasing in others. And we know that these periods of major technological change are always disruptive, and the disruptions can last for decades, generating all kinds of other consequences. We also know that this is a period of extreme inequality. Matthew has already talked about it, so I don't need to go on about it more. And it's global, and it's regional, and it's local. And that inequality has actually accentuated after the pandemic. And that gives you often very unpleasant social political outcomes. It's not just that it's economically bad or that it's unfortunate that some people are getting worse off and some are getting super rich. It's not just about that. It is that it gives you dysfunctional societies. And then we have climate change, which whether you like it or not, it's happening. I mean, I come from a part of the world where you're already experiencing the effects of it. And pretty much I'm in another part of the world where you're experiencing the effects of it right now. So I think we have to recognize that any plans have to factor in, or any strategies of economic revival have to factor all of this in, given the broader aim of giving good quality jobs. Now, here I just want to point out that, look, technology should not be our enemy. I'm completely in agreement with Matt. I mean, technology we should welcome, and especially labor-saving technologies that reduce drudgery, that reduce the arduousness of work and so on, definitely to be welcomed. However, in the absence of supporting policies, And in the absence of other kinds of job generation, they can actually be not just disruptive, they can deny people a chance to livelihood. So you really need to have active intervention to develop jobs that are available for people who are going to be unemployed because of these technological changes. The care economy is a very, very major element of that. So I'm again glad that Matt mentioned the care economy, because it's massively underprovided in our societies. If you even compare, let's say, Sweden levels of care with the rest of Europe, or the rest of Middle and Southern Europe, or the developing world, if we even provided the same number of care workers to population as Sweden does, if we aim to provide that same number by 2030, say, we would have another 250 million jobs globally. So we have to value care work. We have to recognize it. We have to value it. We have to reward it. At the moment, it's not. And at the moment, because it's dominantly provided by women, often in unpaid form, it is degraded, downgraded by society. And we really need to put much more public investment into providing good quality care. We also need to invest a lot more in what I call broadly the creative industries. Google, Netflix, Amazon, Netflix is an example of creative, but it's not the only example. And if you look through history, societies that generated large surpluses because of technology are the ones that could actually employ people in creative industries, because that's what makes the quality of life so much better. So yes, there are many things that you can actually do, but these are not going to happen through market forces alone, because the market signals do not encourage investment in these. So they necessarily require public intervention, whether in the form of active public investment or in the form of fiscal or other incentives, or tweaking the market mechanism to make much more investment in these areas attractive. This is not going to happen without that kind of investment. Then, just on the point of India, look, so far the Indian government has pretty much done everything wrong in terms of dealing with this pandemic, whether on the health side or on the macroeconomic side. And what it has also done is accentuated and intensified the inequalities that already exist in the economy and in society. A major inequality is the gender inequality. We already had one of the lowest women's work participation rates in the world, and that has fallen further in this pandemic. Clearly, we also underprovide care. We have less than 1.5 per population, per 100 workers. Care workers in the population compared to Sweden's 13. There is a massive need to improve both the quantity and the remuneration and quality and training of care workers. So major improvement in expansion of public employment in care work is one of the basic things. Women are disproportionately employed in this. At the moment, they're employed at less than minimum wage by the government, on the guise that they are voluntary workers rather than actual workers. This should be major priority number one. Just filling the vacancies would actually increase total employment by 7 million overnight. Again, many women would likely to be employed in these activities, whether as nurses or teachers or a whole range of other things. And overall, an improvement in the conditions that enable women to work, not just in terms of the burden of household responsibilities and unpaid labor in the home, but also the commuting, the safety to work and at work, and all these other issues that have been massively neglected by the government. Okay, let me stop here.
Thanks for that. That was great. So I guess we are coming to the end now of the allotted time for this webinar. So I just wanted to give everyone the chance to kind of give some kind of concluding remarks. I think Jayati maybe covered some of your concluding remarks just there, but Matt, would you have anything like final to say? And then we'll go on to Matthew, and then Jayati, if you have anything extra to add on, you can finish.
If we want to take this pandemic as being a sort of starting gun point for wholesale societal change, I think we've misread the mood music. I think that we've misread what this moment is. I think that this is a natural disaster to which there is an appropriate time to spend money, to invest, and to ensure that the underlying economy is there in order for it to provide back. I don't think, however, this represents a moment where we suddenly decide that climate change is all consuming and that we're going to change the entirety of the market economy to remove people's preferences for what they can decide they're able and willing to spend the money on, or that what we're going to invest in, which industries we've decided on behalf of others are underprovided or overprovided for. But that said, I do think that this is the time for those interventions to ensure that that we survive through this pandemic period, that we have a good enough economy at the end of it to allow the efficient allocation of resources, and that we allow individuals to rebuild the world as they see fit, not based on what we think or what we have built up as our priorities, but based on theirs.
Amazing, thanks. Matthew.
Great, thanks. Well, interesting session. Thanks very much again. I think I'd agree with Matt that markets can be an extraordinary sort of force for probing new things, finding new things. What I'd argue that as we emerge from this, though, we have to recognise markets as politically constructed, socially defined, and that how you act in that market, how you can sort of define your own plans, depends in part on your resources. And so I think even without the natural disaster, we'd want to be thinking about how do we sort of deeply rethink and democratise our economy, both sort of how you participate in the market, but also how we serve non-market needs. And I think two of the ones that have been mentioned are absolutely fundamental. One is sort of the provision of care, which I think, as I just mentioned, it's not going to be served via market signals particularly well. And that's a fundamental problem with our aging society and with the sort of economy centred on sort of flourishing life as the sort of key thing. And the second is the transition to climate, the transition we need to make in response to not just climate change, which, there's that figure I gave about 3 billion people living in sub-Saharan levels of heat within the lifespan of many people in this call. But it goes much deeper, wider, and more sort of frankly dangerous and sort of reinforcing than that. So I think it's not just a sort of like, it's something we just need to adapt to. And it shouldn't necessarily be like the sole focus of our economy, of course not, but it has to be woven through everything we do. And in that sense, I do think this is a fundamental break. This is not just like an earthquake, it's something much more deep and systemic. And yes, of course, we will sort of move beyond it at some point, but it will leave a legacy. And I think in sort of how we respond to that, we should set ourselves on a sort of path towards dealing with some of these challenges, deep inequality, sort of the crisis of care that so many people are facing, the inequalities both within countries, but I think within the global economy, and absolutely embedding a sort of just transition away from a carbon-intensive economy. So I think, in some ways, maybe there's sort of some shared agreement, but I think there's maybe sort of a deeper sort of divergence in terms of like, how do we actually democratize and reimagine our economy together, not as an imposed plan from the state, but as a sort of collective endeavor.
Amazing, thank you. And Jayati, any last remarks?
Well, no, thanks. I thought Matthew put that very well. I just want to make the final point of raising something that he mentioned earlier, the power imbalances. Both markets and states are characterized by massive power imbalances. And I think a lot of rethinking economics has to be thinking about how we can address those imbalances, because without that, neither states or governments nor markets will actually function in desirable ways.
Okay, amazing. Well, I'd like to say thanks again to all of our panelists. I thought it was an amazing discussion, even though it did get a bit fiery at some points. But overall, it was great to hear from the different perspectives. And I hope that everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did. In terms of after this session, we're hosting like a more informal coffee session for anyone that was an attendee today, for them to just come along. And if you want to talk about some of the ideas we heard today or anything else that Rethinking Economics does, the links have been spammed in the chat, so make sure you click on one of those and join us there. But yeah, apart from that, I'd like to thank again Matt, Matthew and Jayati, and I hope to see you guys and all the attendees at some point in the near future. Thanks, guys.